Chapter 1. A Blank Page in the Bible. St. Mary Mead had always been a place of gentle routines and predictable occurrences. The village square with its neat shops, the vicarage with its well-tended garden, and the church with its ancient spire had remained largely unchanged for generations. It was precisely this predictability that made Miss Jane Marple such an astute observer of the unexpected. On this particular Sunday morning in early spring, Miss Marple sat in her usual pew, her keen blue eyes taking in the familiar scene before her. The church was filled with the usual congregation, Colonel Bantry and his wife occupying their customary place in the front, the Prices from the post office seated toward the back, and young Tommy Jenkins fidgeting beside his mother, earning occasional reproving glances. Miss Marple adjusted her hat slightly and opened her prayer book. The organist, Mr. Palman, was playing the prelude with his characteristic flourishes. Everything was as it should be until the Reverend Leonard Clement stepped up to the pulpit. "I find myself in a most peculiar position this morning," he began, his voice wavering slightly. "The sermon I so carefully prepared seems to have vanished entirely." A murmur rippled through the congregation. Miss Marple's eyebrows rose ever so slightly as she observed the vicar's demeanour. His face was flushed, and there was a nervous quality to his movements that was quite out of character for the usually composed clergyman. "I had placed it within my Bible, as I always do," continued Reverend Clement, opening the large Bible that rested on the pulpit. "But you see," he held up the book, displaying it to the congregation, "there is nothing here but a blank page where my notes should be." Miss Marple leaned forward, intrigued. The vicar was showing them what appeared to be a page torn from a notebook, entirely blank, tucked within the pages of his Bible. This was most unusual indeed. "Nevertheless," said the vicar, recovering his composure, "we shall proceed. Perhaps the absence of my prepared words will allow for divine inspiration to speak more clearly." He delivered an impromptu sermon that morning, speaking about faith in times of uncertainty. Miss Marple listened attentively, but her mind was cataloguing the subtle signs of distress in the vicar's manner. After the service, the congregation filed out into the churchyard, buzzing with curiosity about the morning's peculiar events. Miss Marple lingered, exchanging pleasantries with Mrs. Price and nodding to the doctor's wife, but her attention was fixed on Reverend Clement, who appeared to be in deep conversation with the churchwarden, Mr. Hopkins. "Most unusual, wouldn't you say, Miss Marple?" Miss Marple turned to find Colonel Bantry at her elbow. "Indeed, Colonel, most unusual." She adjusted her gloves thoughtfully. "Reverend Clement is normally so meticulous about his sermons. Do you think someone might have played a prank?" asked the Colonel, his bushy eyebrows drawing together. "Perhaps," replied Miss Marple, her gaze drifting toward the church door where the vicar's wife, Griselda Clement, was now standing. Much younger than her husband, Griselda had a reputation for high spirits and a certain playfulness, though I wonder who would have access to the vicar's Bible before the service. The Colonel harumphed. "Well, it's hardly a matter for concern, just a missing sermon." "Yes," said Miss Marple softly, "just a missing sermon. Though I can't help but wonder why someone would take it and leave a blank page in its place. There must be some purpose to that." As the churchyard emptied, Miss Marple made her way toward the vicarage, having been invited to Sunday lunch by Griselda. The vicar's wife was an indifferent housekeeper and a terrible cook, but Miss Marple always accepted her invitations, finding her company refreshing. The vicarage was a modest stone building adjacent to the church, with a garden that was now showing the first promises of spring. As she approached, Miss Marple noticed the verger, Quincy, emerging from the side door of the church. He was a thin, nervous man with perpetually ink-stained fingers, responsible for maintaining the church records and assisting the vicar. Today he seemed particularly furtive, glancing around quickly before hurrying away. Miss Marple filed this observation away as she entered the vicarage. Inside she found Griselda arranging flowers in the sitting room, while the maid, Clara, set the dining table. "Oh, Miss Marple, so glad you could come," exclaimed Griselda. "Wasn't church extraordinary today?" Poor Leonard is quite beside himself." "It was certainly unexpected," replied Miss Marple. "Has Reverend Clement any idea what might have happened to his sermon?" Griselda shook her head, sending her blonde curls bouncing. "None at all. He prepared it last night, as he always does, and placed it in his Bible. This morning, it was gone, with only that blank page in its place. He's convinced someone must have entered the vicarage during the night, though nothing else seems to be missing." "How very peculiar," murmured Miss Marple. "May I ask what the sermon was about?" "Oh, something about the importance of truth and confession. Leonard's been quite focused on that theme lately," Griselda replied somewhat dismissively. "He spent hours in his study working on it." At that moment, Reverend Clement himself entered the room, still in his clerical collar, though he had removed his robes. "Ah, Miss Marple, how good of you to join us," he said, his smile not quite reaching his eyes. "I must apologize for the rather disorganized service this morning." "Not at all, Vicar," Miss Marple assured him. "These things happen, though I must say, a blank page seems a rather pointed message." The vicar's expression tightened slightly. "Yes, I thought so too. Almost as if someone wished to," he broke off, glancing at his wife. "Well, let us not dwell on it. Clara has prepared a roast, I believe." During lunch, conversation flowed around various village matters, but Miss Marple noticed that the vicar remained preoccupied. Once or twice, she caught him looking at his wife with an expression that seemed almost questioning, as they were finishing their pudding, a rather lumpy custard that Griselda had insisted on making herself. There was a knock at the front door. Clara went to answer it, and returned moments later. "It's Mr. Harmon, sir," she said to the vicar. "He says it's urgent." The organist, Mr. Harmon, was shown into the dining room. He was a rotund man, with thinning hair, who had served the church for over 20 years. "I do apologize for interrupting your meal," he said, twisting his hat in his hands, "but I've just made a most disturbing discovery in the organ loft." "What is it, Harmon?" asked the vicar, rising from his seat. "Another blank page, sir, tucked between the pages of my music book, and beneath it, a note." He produced a folded piece of paper from his pocket. "It says, 'The truth will be revealed at Wednesday's confession.'" The vicar took the note, his face paling as he read it. "This is most irregular," he said quietly. "Most irregular indeed." Miss Marple watched the exchange with interest. "May I?" she asked, holding out her hand for the note. After a moment's hesitation, the vicar passed it to her. The message was typed on plain paper, with no signature. "Wednesday's confession," mused Miss Marple. "That would be during the evening service." "Yes," confirmed the vicar, "though we rarely have more than a handful of people attend the Wednesday evening service. It's primarily for confession and quiet reflection." "I see," said Miss Marple, returning the note. "And have there been any other unusual occurrences at the church recently?" The vicar and the organist exchanged glances. "Well," began Mr. Harmon reluctantly, "there was the matter of the candles last week." "Candles?" prompted Miss Marple. "Yes, in the Lady Chapel. They burned down much faster than they should have, almost as if someone had tampered with them. And then there was the confessional incident," added the vicar, his voice lowered. I thought I heard whispers coming from the confessional when no one was supposed to be there. When I checked, it was empty." Miss Marple nodded thoughtfully. "How very interesting. It seems that someone is trying to create an atmosphere of, shall we say, anticipation." "But for what purpose?" asked Griselda, who had been uncharacteristically quiet during this exchange. "That," said Miss Marple, folding her napkin neatly, "is precisely what we must discover before Wednesday evening." Chapter 2. The organist's silent note. Monday morning dawned with a fine mist hanging over St. Mary Mead. Miss Marple was tending to her spring bulbs when she heard the gate to her garden cottage creak open. Looking up, she was surprised to see Mr. Harmon, the church organist, making his way up the path. His typically jovial face was drawn with worry. "Miss Marple," he began without preamble, "I wonder if I might have a word." It's about yesterday's incident." "Of course," replied Miss Marple, removing her gardening gloves. "Do come inside. I was just about to put the kettle on." Inside her cosy sitting room with its chintz-covered chairs and collection of delicate porcelain figurines, Miss Marple poured tea while Mr. Harmon perched anxiously on the edge of a chair. "It's most unusual for me to call on you like this," he said, accepting the cup with slightly trembling hands. "But after what happened at lunch yesterday, I felt I needed to speak with someone discreet, and everyone in the village knows that you have a certain insight into these matters." Miss Marple inclined her head modestly. "People do tend to confide in me. What is troubling you, Mr. Harmon?" The organist placed his cup down with a clatter. "There's more to this business than just a missing sermon. You see, for the past few weeks, I've noticed someone has been in the organ loft when I'm not there." "Indeed? How can you tell?" asked Miss Marple, her knitting needles now in her hands, clicking steadily as she spoke. "Small things at first. My music rearranged, a pencil not where I left it. Then last week I discovered something truly disturbing." He reached into his pocket and withdrew a folded sheet of music. "This was inserted into my hymnal for Sunday's service." Miss Marple took the paper. It appeared to be a standard hymn, except that one note, middle C, had been carefully erased from every line of the music. "How very peculiar," she murmured. "That's not all," continued Mr. Harmon. "When I played yesterday morning, just before the vicar discovered his sermon was missing, the middle C key on the organ wouldn't produce any sound. It had been tampered with." "A silent note," said Miss Marple thoughtfully. "And you believe this is connected to the vicar's missing sermon?" "I do," nodded Mr. Harmon emphatically. "You see, Miss Marple, the vicar's sermon was about truth and confession, and there's something you should know about Wednesday evening services." He lowered his voice. "Despite there being no one else present, the confessional at St. Mary Mead isn't used often, but the vicar makes it available after Wednesday evening prayers. And recently I've heard things," prompted Miss Marple gently when he hesitated. "Whispers, heated conversations. Once I was practicing late and overheard the vicar in what sounded like an argument with someone in the confessional. I couldn't make out the words, but he sounded distressed." Miss Marple's knitting paused momentarily. "When was this?" "2 weeks ago, and ever since he's been different, preoccupied, writing sermons about truth and the burden of secrets." Harmon fidgeted with his teacup. "And now this business with the blank pages and my silent C note. It can't be coincidence." "Indeed," agreed Miss Marple. "In my experience, there are rarely such things as coincidences. May I ask, Mr. Harmon, who else besides yourself has access to the organ loft?" "Well, that's just it," he replied. "It's usually kept locked, and only the vicar, myself, and the verger have keys, though I suppose Griselda might have access through her husband." "Griselda?" Miss Marple's eyebrows rose slightly. "Do you have any reason to think Mrs. Clement might be involved?" Mr. Harmon looked uncomfortable. "I wouldn't want to speak out of turn, but she's so much younger than the vicar, isn't she? And quite lively. There have been rumors." "Rumors often contain a grain of truth," Miss Marple said diplomatically, "though seldom the whole truth. Is there anything else you've observed that might be relevant?" The organist hesitated. "Well, there is one thing. Last Wednesday after the evening service, I returned to the church because I'd forgotten my gloves. I saw Mr. Quincy, the verger, coming out of the vicar's study. He seemed startled to see me, and his fingers were stained with ink, more so than usual." "The verger?" mused Miss Marple. "Yes, I noticed him yesterday, looking rather furtive as he left the church." Their conversation was interrupted by the telephone ringing. Miss Marple excused herself to answer it, returning moments later with a troubled expression. "That was Griselda Clement," she informed Mr. Harmon. "It seems there's been another development. She's asked if I might come to the vicarage right away." "Another blank page?" asked Mr. Harmon anxiously. "No," replied Miss Marple. "Something quite different. The vicar has received a note, apparently slipped under the door of his study, warning him not to proceed with Wednesday's confession. Griselda sounds quite distressed. The pair made their way to the vicarage, finding Griselda pacing the sitting room. Her usual vivacity was subdued, and she clutched a handkerchief in her fingers. "Oh, Miss Marple, thank you for coming so quickly. And Mr. Harmon, too. I'm glad you're here." She gestured toward the vicar's study. "Leonard is inside. He's been there since the note arrived this morning." When they entered the study, they found Reverend Clement seated behind his desk, his face ashen. Before him lay another sheet of paper. "Miss Marple," he acknowledged with a nod. "I suspect Griselda has explained the situation. She mentioned a note," replied Miss Marple gently. "May I see it?" The vicar pushed the paper across the desk. Like the previous message, it was typed on plain paper without a signature. It read simply, "Wednesday's confession must not take place. Some truths are better left unspoken." "This arrived this morning?" asked Miss Marple. "Yes, under the study door. I found it when I came in after breakfast, and the door to the vicarage was locked." "Yes, though the study has a separate entrance from the garden. That door is usually locked as well, but—" "But?" prompted Miss Marple. "I sometimes forget to lock it when I'm working late," admitted the vicar. "I was in here until quite late last night preparing for Wednesday's service." Miss Marple glanced around the study. It was a modest room lined with bookshelves, a large desk dominating the center. On the desk were several books of sermon notes, a typewriter, and an inkwell. Behind the desk, a window overlooked the garden, and a side door led directly outside. "Mr. Harmon has just been telling me about some unusual occurrences in the organ loft," said Miss Marple. "A missing note, middle C to be precise." The vicar looked startled. "Middle C? That's significant." "Is it, vicar?" asked Miss Marple, her keen blue eyes fixed on his face. Reverend Clement seemed to struggle internally before responding. "C could stand for confession, could it not? Or perhaps conscience." "Or for Clement," added Griselda quietly from the doorway. An uncomfortable silence fell over the room. "Leonard," Griselda continued, her voice uncharacteristically serious, "I think it's time you told us what's really going on. These messages, the missing sermon, they're clearly directed at you. What is supposed to happen at Wednesday's confession?" The vicar looked at his wife, then at Miss Marple and Mr. Harmon. He seemed to be weighing his words carefully. "I received a letter last month," he began slowly. "Anonymous, like these notes. It claimed that someone in the parish was harboring a terrible secret, something that needed to be confessed and brought to light. The writer said they would reveal everything during Wednesday's confession." "And you have no idea who sent it?" asked Miss Marple. "None," replied the vicar. "But since then there have been these incidents. The whispers in the confessional when no one was there, the candles burning too quickly, and now my sermon vanishing and these threatening notes. It seems," said Miss Marple thoughtfully, "that someone is very determined either to ensure this confession takes place or to prevent it." "But who?" asked Griselda, "and what could be so important about this secret?" Before anyone could respond, there was a knock at the study door. Clara, the maid, entered with a worried expression. "Excuse me, sir, but Mr. Quincy is here. He says it's urgent. Something about the church organ." The verger entered, his thin frame tense with anxiety, the perpetual ink stains on his fingers even more pronounced than usual. "Vicar, forgive the interruption, but there's something you need to see right away. The organ, it's been damaged." "Damaged?" exclaimed Mr. Harmon, rising to his feet. "What do you mean, damaged?" "Someone has removed all the C pipes," replied Mr. Quincy. "Every single one. And in their place," he held out his hand, revealing a small, folded piece of paper. "I found this." The vicar took the paper and unfolded it with trembling fingers. As he read it, the color drained from his face. "What does it say?" asked Griselda, moving to her husband's side. The vicar's voice was barely above a whisper as he read, "Silence the confession, or the truth will destroy more than just music." Miss Marple watched the faces around her carefully. Mr. Harmon appeared genuinely shocked. Griselda's expression was a mixture of fear and confusion. Quincy's eyes darted nervously around the room, his ink-stained fingers fidgeting with the cuff of his jacket. "I believe," said Miss Marple, breaking the tense silence, "that we should examine the organ loft immediately. Mr. Quincy, would you be so kind as to show us exactly where you found this note?" As they prepared to leave for the church, Miss Marple quietly observed Mr. Quincy. There was something about his nervous demeanor and those ink-stained fingers that tugged at her memory, reminding her of young Tommy Simpkins, who had once tried to forge his father's signature on a school note. Deception often left its marks, both visible and invisible, and somewhere in Mary Mead, someone was going to extraordinary lengths to either reveal a truth or keep it hidden. "Coming, Miss Marple?" called Griselda from the doorway. "Yes, dear," replied Miss Marple, gathering her thoughts. "I'm most interested to see these missing pipes." Chapter 3. A whisper in the confessional. The organ loft of St. Mary Mead's church was a cramped space, reached by a narrow spiral staircase. As Miss Marple carefully ascended, steadying herself against the stone wall, she could hear the voices of the others already assembled above. The vicar's concerned tones mingled with Mr. Harmon's more agitated exclamations. When she finally reached the top, slightly breathless, she found Mr. Harmon bent over the organ, his expression one of dismay. The wooden panel at the back of the instrument had been removed, revealing the complex arrangement of pipes within, or rather the conspicuous absence of certain pipes. "Every C pipe," Mr. Harmon was saying, gesturing in distress. "Every single one from the lowest to the highest octave, and without damaging the surrounding mechanism, which would require considerable knowledge of organ construction." "When did you last play the organ, Mr. Harmon?" asked Miss Marple, approaching the instrument. "Yesterday morning for the service," he replied. "Everything was fine then, except for the middle C key not producing sound. This is new damage. And you found the note tucked where exactly, Mr. Quincy?" Miss Marple turned to the verger, who was hovering near the staircase. "It was here, Miss Marple," he said, pointing to the empty space where the middle C pipe should have been, "folded and tucked right into the gap." Miss Marple bent to examine the spot. "Most interesting. And the church has been locked since yesterday's service?" "Yes," confirmed the vicar. "I locked it myself after everyone had left." "And who has keys to the church?" continued Miss Marple. "Myself, Mr. Harmon, Mr. Quincy, and the church warden, Mr. Hopkins," replied Reverend Clement. "And Griselda has access to my set, of course." Griselda, who had been silently examining the damaged organ, looked up sharply. "You can't possibly think I had anything to do with this, Leonard." "Of course not, my dear," the vicar hastened to reassure her. "Miss Marple is simply establishing the facts." "Facts indeed," murmured Miss Marple. "And the fact is that someone with access to the church, and with knowledge of organs, has gone to considerable trouble to silence every C note. A very specific message, wouldn't you say?" "But what message?" asked Griselda. "What does the letter C have to do with any of this?" "As the vicar suggested earlier, it could stand for confession," Miss Marple replied. "Or conscience. Or perhaps—" She paused, her gaze settling briefly on Mr. Quincy. "Concealment." The verger shifted uncomfortably under her scrutiny. "I really should be getting back to my duties," he said. "There's the parish registry to update, and the notices for Wednesday's service to prepare." "Wednesday's service," repeated Miss Marple, "which brings us back to the confession that someone is so determined to either reveal or suppress. Vicar, you mentioned that you received an anonymous letter last month. Have you any idea what secret this person might be referring to?" Reverend Clement hesitated. I have my suspicions, but nothing concrete. As a vicar, I am privy to many confidences. Of course, nodded Miss Marple. The sanctity of the confessional. Though I understand the confessional at St. Mary Mead is seldom used in the formal sense. That's true, acknowledged the vicar. We aren't high church here. The confessional booth is mostly symbolic, a quiet place for private prayer or counsel. But occasionally, parishioners do use it to unburden themselves. And you mentioned overhearing whispers in the confessional when no one was supposed to be there, Miss Marple said. When exactly was this? About 2 weeks ago, replied the vicar. I had returned to the church in the evening to retrieve some papers from my study. As I passed the confessional, I distinctly heard whispering from inside. When I checked, there was no one there. Most peculiar, said Miss Marple. Mr. Harmon mentioned something similar, I believe. The organist nodded. Yes, I've heard it too, always in the evening, and always when the church should be empty. I wonder, mused Miss Marple, if it might be possible to hear these whispers again, particularly this evening. You want to wait in the church tonight? Asked Griselda, surprised. If the vicar has no objection, replied Miss Marple. These whispers seem to be a key part of our puzzle. I have no objection, said Reverend Clement slowly, though I'm not sure what you hope to discover. Sometimes, said Miss Marple with a gentle smile, the simplest explanations are revealed when we take the time to listen carefully. Now perhaps we should examine the confessional itself. The group descended from the organ loft and made their way to the confessional booth, situated in a shadowy alcove near the back of the church. It was a simple wooden structure, divided into 2 compartments, one for the priest, one for the penitent, with a grille between them. May I? Asked Miss Marple, gesturing to the booth. The vicar nodded, and Miss Marple stepped into the penitent's side of the confessional. It was dim inside, with only a small shaft of light filtering through the grille. She sat on the narrow bench and closed her eyes, concentrating on the sounds around her. The church was quiet, save for the soft footsteps of her companions waiting outside. After a moment, she emerged. There's something not quite right about the acoustics in there, she said, thoughtfully. When I'm inside, I can hear the slightest movements from all of you quite clearly, despite the distance. And yet, she paused, looking up at the high ceiling of the church. There's also a curious echo. The church's acoustics have always been somewhat unusual, commented Mr. Harmon. It's one of the reasons the organ sounds so magnificent in here. Yes, quite, said Miss Marple, her eyes now fixed on a corner of the confessional booth. Mr. Quincy, might I trouble you for a ladder? There's something I'd like to examine up there. The verger looked startled. A ladder? Whatever for? There's a small gap between the top of the confessional and the wall, explained Miss Marple. I'd like to see what's in that space. Mr. Quincy reluctantly went to fetch a ladder from the vestry. When he returned, he set it up beside the confessional, and Mr. Harmon steadied it as Miss Marple prepared to climb. Oh dear, I'm not as spry as I once was, she admitted with a small laugh. Perhaps someone younger might. I'll go, offered Griselda quickly. What am I looking for? Anything unusual in the space between the confessional and the wall, replied Miss Marple. Griselda climbed the ladder and peered into the gap. There's something here, she called down after a moment. It looks like a small device of some kind. She reached in and carefully extracted a compact object, then descended the ladder. What on earth is that? Asked the vicar, examining the item in his wife's hands. If I'm not mistaken, said Miss Marple, it's a recording device, similar to the one my nephew Raymond showed me last Christmas. A dictaphone, I believe he called it. A recording device? Repeated Mr. Harmon incredulously. In the church. How extraordinary, said Miss Marple, though her tone suggested she was not entirely surprised. I wonder what it might have recorded. The vicar took the device and examined it. It seems to be switched off now, but if it was recording, Then perhaps it captured the mysterious whispers, suggested Miss Marple. Or perhaps it was the source of them. Modern technology can be quite remarkable. But who would place such a device in the church? Asked Griselda. And why? Someone with an interest in what happens in the confessional, replied Miss Marple. Someone who might be gathering information or creating a deliberate atmosphere of unease. At that moment the church door opened, and Colonel Bantry entered, looking somewhat surprised to find the group gathered around the confessional. "Ah, good afternoon," he said, removing his hat. "I was just passing and thought I'd check the hymn board for Wednesday's service. My wife is keen to know if her favorite hymn will be included." "I'm afraid we haven't finalized the hymns yet, Colonel," said the vicar. "We've been somewhat distracted by recent events." "Yes, I heard about the sermon going missing," nodded the colonel. "Most peculiar." "And now what's all this about a recording device?" Miss Marple quickly explained their discovery. The colonel examined the dictaphone with interest. "Military intelligence used similar devices during the war," he remarked. "Quite sophisticated for civilian use, though. I wonder." He turned the device over and pressed a small button on the side. Immediately, a whispering voice filled the quiet church. "The truth cannot remain hidden forever. Confession is good for the soul, but fatal for reputations." Wednesday evening, the final reckoning. The voice was distorted, clearly disguised, but there was something familiar about its cadence. The recording continued. "The silent C is the key. When the music stops, the truth begins." Then, even more disturbingly, another voice joined in, a voice that was unmistakably the vicar's. "Some secrets are better left buried. Some confessions should never be made." Reverend Clement stood frozen, his face ashen. "That's my voice," he whispered, "but I never said those words." "Modern technology," said Miss Marple gravely, "can be used to deceive as well as to reveal. I suspect this recording has been cleverly edited to create the impression of a conversation that never happened." "But why?" asked Griselda, taking her husband's arm supportively. "Who would go to such lengths?" "Someone with a great deal at stake," replied Miss Marple. "Someone who either wishes to force a confession or prevent one. The question is, which?" The colonel was still examining the dictaphone. "There's something else recorded here," he said, pressing another button. "It seems to be a different conversation. This time, the whispers were less distinct, but one voice could be clearly heard saying, 'The page is blank because the truth has been erased. But I know, I've always known, and now everyone will know.'" "The blank page in the Bible," murmured Miss Marple. "Everything is connected." "I think," said the vicar, his voice steadier now, "that we should adjourn to the vicarage. This discussion is better continued in private." As they prepared to leave the church, Miss Marple noticed Mr. Quincy lingering by the parish registry on a small desk near the entrance. He appeared to be making an entry, his ink-stained fingers moving swiftly across the page. "Mr. Quincy," she called to him, "will you be joining us at the vicarage?" The verger looked up, startled. "No, Miss Marple. I have administrative duties to attend to. Parish records that can't wait." "I see," said Miss Marple, with a smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. "Well, do be sure to lock the church when you leave. We wouldn't want any more disturbances." As they walked the short path to the vicarage, Miss Marple fell into step beside Colonel Bantry. "Colonel," she said quietly, "I wonder if you might do me a small favor this evening." "Certainly, Miss Marple," replied the colonel. "What did you have in mind?" "I'd like to keep watch in the church tonight," she explained, "to see if our mysterious whisperer returns. But I don't think I should do so alone." "Say no more," nodded the colonel. "Military operations were my specialty, surveillance and ambush." "I'll bring my old service revolver." "Oh, I don't think that will be necessary," intervened Miss Marple hastily. "Just your company, and perhaps a thermos of tea would be quite sufficient." At the vicarage, over a hastily prepared tea, they discussed the implications of their discoveries. The recording device, the missing C pipes, the blank page, the threatening notes, all pointed to an elaborate scheme centered around Wednesday's confession service. "There's one thing that puzzles me," said Miss Marple, stirring her tea thoughtfully. The verger, Mr. Quincy, seemed quite concerned about parish records. "Vicar, has there been any irregularity in the church's documentation recently?" Reverend Clement frowned. "Not that I'm aware of, though, to be honest, I leave most of the administrative work to Mr. Quincy. He's been the verger for over 15 years and knows the system better than I do. And these records, they include births, deaths, marriages, and so forth," continued Miss Marple. "Yes, and baptisms, confirmations, parish accounts," nodded the vicar. "Standard church records, I see," said Miss Marple. "And has anyone requested access to these records recently? Someone researching family history, perhaps?" The vicar thought for a moment. "Now that you mention it, there was someone. About a month ago, a woman who said she was researching her genealogy. Mr. Quincy helped her, I believe." "Do you recall her name?" asked Miss Marple. "I'm afraid not. I only saw her briefly." "Quincy would know." Miss Marple nodded, filing this information away. "One more question, if I may. This woman, did she happen to have any connection to music? Was she perhaps musical?" "I couldn't say," replied the vicar, though he paused, his forehead creasing in concentration. "Now that I think of it, Mr. Harmon mentioned that she had asked about the organ, said she had an interest in church music." Miss Marple's eyes lit up with interest. "Did she indeed? How very interesting. It seems our mysterious visitor had quite diverse interests: genealogy, parish records, and church organs." "You think she might be connected to these events?" asked Griselda. "It's merely a possibility," replied Miss Marple. "But in my experience, coincidences often turn out to be connections, and I can't help but wonder what this woman might have discovered in your parish records that could be worth all this elaborate deception." As the afternoon light began to fade, Miss Marple rose to leave. "Colonel Bantry, shall we meet at the church at 8 o'clock? That should give us ample time to position ourselves before the usual evening stillness descends." "I'll be there," confirmed the colonel. "And don't worry, Vicar. We'll get to the bottom of this mystery before Wednesday evening comes." But as Miss Marple walked home to prepare for her evening vigil, she couldn't shake the feeling that they were dealing with something far more complex than mere mischief. Somewhere in the whispers and silences of St. Mary Mead, a truth was struggling to be heard, a truth that someone was desperate to either reveal or suppress, no matter the cost. Chapter 4: The Candle That Burned Too Fast. The church of St. Mary Mead was eerily silent as Miss Marple and Colonel Bantry took their positions behind the heavy curtain that screened off a small alcove near the Lady Chapel. It was just past 8 o'clock, and the last rays of the spring sun filtered through the stained glass windows, creating pools of coloured light on the stone floor. "Quite like old times," whispered the colonel, settling himself on the small wooden bench they had positioned behind the curtain. "Reminds me of a stakeout in Cairo during the war. We waited 3 days for a particular agent to show himself." "I do hope we won't need to wait that long," replied Miss Marple softly, arranging her knitting in her lap. Even during a surveillance operation, she saw no reason to waste precious time. Though patience is often rewarded in these matters, they had chosen their hiding place carefully. From their position, they had a clear view of both the confessional and the side entrance to the church, while remaining hidden from anyone who might enter. The vicar had provided them with a key, ensuring they could lock themselves in and prevent any disturbance. "What exactly are we looking for, Miss Marple?" asked the colonel, keeping his voice low. "This business with recording devices and missing organ pipes seems more suited to espionage than village affairs." "In my experience, Colonel," replied Miss Marple, her knitting needles clicking softly, "human nature remains the same, whether in international intrigue or village disputes. Someone is going to extraordinary lengths to create an atmosphere of unease around Wednesday's confession service. The question is whether they intend to force a revelation or prevent one. And which do you think it is?" Miss Marple considered this. "I'm inclined to think the latter. The removal of the sea pipes, the threatening notes, These seem designed to silence something rather than reveal it, but we shall see. They fell into a companionable silence. The Colonel occasionally sipped from his thermos of tea while Miss Marple's knitting progressed steadily. Outside, darkness fell completely, and the church was illuminated only by the soft glow of the sanctuary lamp and a few candles in the Lady Chapel. It was nearly 9 o'clock when they heard the faint sound of a key turning in the lock of the side door. Both froze, Miss Marple's knitting needles suddenly still in her hands. The door opened quietly, and a figure slipped inside, moving with the confidence of someone familiar with the surroundings despite the dim light. The Colonel tensed, ready to spring into action, but Miss Marple laid a restraining hand on his arm. "Wait," she whispered. "Let's see what they do." The figure moved toward the Lady Chapel, where a small array of votive candles flickered before a statue of the Virgin Mary. In the dim light it was difficult to make out details, but Miss Marple could see it was a woman, dressed in dark clothing. She appeared to be examining the candles intently. Then, to their surprise, the woman began to replace the candles with new ones that she withdrew from a bag. She worked methodically, removing each burning candle and substituting another that looked identical. "What on earth is she doing?" breathed the Colonel. "Something most interesting," murmured Miss Marple. "She's replacing the candles with ones that will burn down more quickly." "But why would anyone—" "Shh," cautioned Miss Marple, as the woman finished her task and turned toward the confessional. The mysterious visitor approached the wooden booth where they had discovered the recording device earlier that day. She opened the door to the penitent's side and appeared to be examining the interior carefully. After a moment she reached up to the spot where the device had been hidden and felt around the space. Finding nothing, she withdrew her hand and stood still, as if considering her next move. "She's looking for the dictaphone," whispered Miss Marple. "She doesn't know we've found it." The woman then moved to the priest's side of the confessional and repeated her search. Finding nothing there either, she emerged looking clearly agitated. She glanced around the church, then moved purposefully toward the vestry door. "Should we stop her?" asked the Colonel. "Not yet," replied Miss Marple. "I want to see what she does next." The woman disappeared into the vestry. A few minutes later she returned carrying something in her hands, a large leather-bound book that Miss Marple recognized as the parish registry. The woman took the book to the altar, where a single candle provided just enough light to read by, and began flipping through the pages with purpose. "The parish records," breathed Miss Marple. "Just as I suspected." They watched as the woman found what she was looking for, and bent closer to examine a particular page. She then withdrew a small object from her pocket, a fountain pen by the look of it, and appeared to make an alteration to the record. "By Jove, she's falsifying the parish records," exclaimed the Colonel, a bit too loudly. The woman's head snapped up at the sound. She quickly closed the book, gathering it in her arms, and peered into the darkness. "Who's there?" she called, her voice tense but controlled. Miss Marple sighed. "I think our cover is blown, Colonel. We might as well make ourselves known." She stood, setting aside her knitting, and stepped out from behind the curtain. "Good evening. I believe we haven't been properly introduced." The woman backed away, clutching the parish registry to her chest. As she moved into the pool of light cast by the altar candle, Miss Marple could see her clearly for the first time. She was middle-aged, with a stern face and hair pulled back in a severe bun. She wore a dark coat and practical shoes, giving her the appearance of a governess or schoolmistress. "Who are you?" demanded the woman, her eyes darting between Miss Marple and the Colonel, who had also emerged from their hiding place. "My name is Jane Marple," replied Miss Marple calmly. "And this is Colonel Bantry. We're quite interested in your activities here this evening, particularly your attention to those candles and the parish registry." The woman's lips thinned. "This is a private matter. It doesn't concern you." "I'm afraid it does," said Miss Marple. "When someone tampers with church property and alters official records, it becomes a matter of public concern, Not to mention the business with the organ pipes and the threatening notes to the vicar. A flash of surprise crossed the woman's face. "I don't know what you're talking about," she said, but her voice lacked conviction. "Come now," said Colonel Bantry, stepping forward. "We've caught you red-handed. Best to come clean." The woman clutched the registry tighter. "You don't understand. This has nothing to do with the vicar or his silly sermon. This is about justice." "Justice?" echoed Miss Marple. "What sort of justice requires falsifying records and creating elaborate distractions?" "The kind that's been denied for 30 years, snapped the woman. Her composure was cracking, revealing a deep-seated anger beneath. "The kind that's been buried in these pages, hidden by respectability and lies." "Perhaps," suggested Miss Marple gently, "you should start at the beginning. Who are you?" The woman hesitated, then seemed to come to a decision. "My name is Catherine Barton. My mother was Rose Barton. She worked as a housemaid at the old Priory House 30 years ago." "The Priory House," mused Colonel Bantry. "That would have been when old Sir Geoffrey Hawkins was still alive." "Yes," confirmed Catherine, her voice bitter. "Sir Geoffrey Hawkins, the respected magistrate, the pillar of the community. The man who took advantage of my 16-year-old mother and then cast her aside when she found herself with child." "With child?" repeated Miss Marple softly. "With you?" Catherine nodded. "My mother was sent away in disgrace. She died giving birth to me. I was raised by her sister in Manchester, never knowing who my father was until my aunt told me on her deathbed last year. She gave me my mother's diary, which detailed everything, including the fact that Reverend Clement's predecessor had agreed to record my birth in the parish registry, but without naming my father. And now you've come to amend the record," concluded Miss Marple, "to name Sir Geoffrey as your father." "It's my right," said Catherine fiercely. "He denied me all my life. Now he's dead, but his name should be on my birth record. The truth should be known." "But what does this have to do with the candles?" asked Colonel Bantry, clearly struggling to make the connection. "The Hawkins family has always donated the candles for the Lady Chapel," explained Catherine. "Even now Lady Hawkins continues the tradition. I wanted to disrupt that tradition, to make the candles burn down unnaturally fast, as a symbol of how quickly a family's good name can be consumed when the truth comes to light." "A symbolic gesture," nodded Miss Marple. "And the recording device in the confessional." Catherine looked defensive. "I overheard the vicar talking to Lady Hawkins one day. She was concerned about rumours that someone was asking questions about her late husband. The vicar assured her that certain matters were better left in the past, for everyone's sake. I wanted to record their conversations to have proof of their collusion in maintaining these secrets. And the missing sermon, the notes threatening to reveal all at Wednesday's confession," pressed Miss Marple. At this, Catherine looked genuinely confused. "What sermon? What notes? I came here to research my birth record and alter it accordingly. Yes, I replaced the candles and placed the recording device, but I know nothing about any sermon or confession service." Miss Marple and the Colonel exchanged glances. "You didn't remove the C pipes from the organ?" asked Miss Marple. "The organ pipes?" "Of course not," replied Catherine, sounding offended. "What would be the point of that?" Miss Marple considered this carefully. Either Catherine Barton was an exceptionally good actress, or she was telling the truth, at least about not being responsible for all the recent disturbances at the church. "It seems," said Miss Marple thoughtfully, "that we may have more than one person with secrets to protect or reveal in St. Mary Mead." At that moment the side door of the church opened again, and another figure entered. In the dim light, they could make out the tall, thin form of Mr. Quincy, the verger. He froze when he saw the group gathered by the altar. "Good evening, Mr. Quincy," called Miss Marple pleasantly. "What brings you to the church at this late hour?" The verger hesitated in the doorway. "I forgot some important papers," he stammered, his hand moving unconsciously to his pocket. "I didn't expect anyone to be here." Miss Marple noticed that his fingers were, as always, stained with ink, but tonight there seemed to be something different about them. Not just ink, but perhaps a smudge of something else, something that caught the light, oddly. "Mr. Quincy," said Miss Marple, "I wonder if you might shed some light on recent events. This is Miss Catherine Barton, who has been conducting some research into the parish records, but she claims to know nothing about the missing sermon or the threatening notes." The verger's eyes darted to Catherine, then back to Miss Marple. "I don't know what you're talking about," he said, echoing Catherine's earlier denial, but there was a tension in his voice that hadn't been there before. "I think you do," said Miss Marple firmly. "Those ink-stained fingers of yours, they're not just from keeping parish records, are they? They're from handling carbon paper, the kind used for making copies of notes, perhaps?" Mr. Quincy took a step backward. "This is absurd. I'm the verger. I've served this church faithfully for 15 years. "Indeed you have," agreed Miss Marple, "which gives you unparalleled access to the church, the vicarage, the organ loft, and the knowledge of how to remove sea-pipes without damaging the mechanism." The verger's face had gone pale. "I don't have to listen to this," he said, turning toward the door. "The sea-pipes," continued Miss Marple, raising her voice slightly. "C for confession, as we thought, but also C for Clement and for Quincy. The two men who know about the events of 30 years ago." Mr. Quincy froze, his back to them. "What are you suggesting?" "I'm suggesting," said Miss Marple, "that you were also at the Priory House 30 years ago. Perhaps as a young footman or gardener, you knew about Sir Geoffrey and Rose Barton. You might even have been a friend to Rose, and when the current vicar discovered something in the old records, something that might bring this secret to light, you became alarmed." The verger turned slowly to face them. "The vicar found an old letter," he said quietly, "tucked into the back of the previous vicar's personal Bible. A letter from Rose Barton, begging for help, naming names. He showed it to me, asked if I knew anything about it. He was planning to research further, to speak about the importance of truth and confession in his sermon. So you took the sermon," concluded Miss Marple, "and left a blank page in its place, symbolic of the blank space where a father's name should be in the parish registry." Catherine was looking between them in confusion. "You knew my mother?" she asked Mr. Quincy. The verger nodded slowly. "I was a gardener's boy at the Priory. Your mother and we were friends. I tried to help her, but Sir Geoffrey was powerful. No one would stand against him. When she was sent away, I lost track of her. I didn't know she had died, or that there was a child." "But why the elaborate scheme with the missing sermon and the threats?" asked Colonel Bantry. "Why not simply tell the vicar the truth?" "Because it's not just about Sir Geoffrey," replied Mr. Quincy, his voice hollow. "It's about who helped cover up the scandal, who ensured Rose was sent away with no support, no acknowledgement, who maintained the fiction of the Hawkins family's respectability all these years." "Lady Hawkins," said Miss Marple softly. Mr. Quincy nodded. "Lady Hawkins, who still wields considerable influence in this village, who still donates generously to the church, who could still make life very difficult for many people, including myself. So you created this elaborate distraction," concluded Miss Marple. "The missing sermon, the threatening notes about Wednesday's confession, all to prevent the vicar from pursuing his investigation into Rose Barton's letter." "I never meant any harm," insisted Mr. Quincy. "I just wanted to protect the past, to let sleeping dogs lie. What good could come from revealing it all now?" "The truth," said Catherine Barton simply. "Justice for my mother, recognition of who I am." As they stood in the dim light of the church, surrounded by centuries of village history, Miss Marple felt a profound sense of the ways in which the past continued to shape the present. Secrets long buried were pushing their way to the surface, demanding acknowledgement. "I believe," she said finally, "that we should continue this discussion with the vicar present. There is more to this story than has yet been revealed, and Wednesday's confession service is still approaching rapidly. The candles in the Lady Chapel, replaced by Catherine with ones designed to burn too quickly, were already half consumed, their flames reflected in the tears that now ran down her cheeks as she contemplated the truth about her mother's fate and the father who had never acknowledged her. Chapter 5. Ink-Stained Fingers. The vicarage sitting room was crowded the following morning. Reverend Clement sat in his armchair, his face grave as he listened to the account of the previous night's events. Beside him stood Griselda, her youthful face unusually serious. Miss Marple occupied the settee, with Colonel Bantry perched on its arm. Mr. Quincy, the verger, sat stiffly on a straight-backed chair, his ink-stained hands clasped in his lap, and in the far corner, as if trying to distance herself from the others, stood Catherine Barton. "So you see, Vicar," Miss Marple concluded, having related their discoveries, "we appear to have not one mystery, but several intertwined ones. Miss Barton's quest to amend her birth record, Mr. Quincy's efforts to prevent certain truths from coming to light, and the matter of your missing sermon." "I see," said the vicar, removing his spectacles and pinching the bridge of his nose. "It seems that the past has a way of intruding on the present, whether we wish it to or not." He turned to Catherine. "Miss Barton, I am deeply sorry for what happened to your mother. While it was before my time in this parish, that does not lessen the injustice she suffered." Catherine's face remained impassive, though her eyes glistened with unshed tears. "I don't want sympathy, Vicar. I want the truth acknowledged. My birth record should show who my father was, and it shall," assured Reverend Clement. "The record can be amended with proper documentation. The letter you mentioned, Miss Marple, the one I found in my predecessor's Bible, may provide the necessary evidence." "You still have it?" asked Miss Marple. "Yes, I kept it in my study." He glanced at Mr. Quincy, along with the notes for my sermon. The verger shifted uncomfortably, his fingers unconsciously rubbing against each other, spreading the ink stains further. "I took the sermon, Vicar, I admit it. When you told me what you planned to preach about, the importance of truth and confession, I feared you would reveal what you had discovered about Sir Geoffrey Hawkins. And why should that concern you so deeply, Mr. Quincy?" asked Miss Marple gently. "You said you were friends with Rose Barton. Surely you would want justice for her memory." Mr. Quincy's gaze fell to his ink-stained hands. "Justice is rarely simple, Miss Marple, especially when it comes after so many years. There's more to your story than you told us last night, isn't there?" pressed Miss Marple. The verger remained silent for a long moment, then spoke in a voice barely above a whisper. "Rose Barton was more than a friend to me. I loved her. We had plans to marry before Sir Geoffrey took an interest in her." "I see," said Miss Marple softly. "Then you must have been devastated when she was sent away." "I tried to find her," continued Mr. Quincy, the words seeming to pour out now that he had begun. "But her family had moved her to Manchester, and I had no way to reach her. I didn't know she had died, or that she had left behind a child." He looked up at Catherine. "Your child?" Catherine stared at him. "What are you saying?" "I'm saying that Sir Geoffrey might not be your father after all." Mr. Quincy's voice was stronger now. "Rose and we were together before she caught Sir Geoffrey's eye. The timing, it's possible that I am your father." A shocked silence fell over the room. Catherine's face had gone pale. "No," she said at last. "My mother's diary was clear. Sir Geoffrey Hawkins was my father. She wrote it explicitly." "Did she?" asked Mr. Quincy. "Or did she write that Sir Geoffrey was responsible for her disgrace, for her being sent away? There's a difference." "Show me this diary," demanded Reverend Clement, his voice firm but kind, "and I will show you the letter I found. Perhaps together they will reveal the truth." Catherine hesitated, then reached into her handbag and withdrew a small leather-bound book. "I've carried it with me since my aunt gave it to me. It's all I have of my mother." The vicar rose and left the room, returning moments later with a yellowed envelope. And this is the letter I found tucked into the back of my predecessor's personal Bible. It was dated just days before Rose Barton was sent away from St. Mary Mead. Miss Marple watched carefully as these two pieces of evidence were placed side by side on the small table in the center of the room. The diary, with its faded ink and worn pages, and the letter, its envelope discolored with age, both held pieces of a 30-year-old puzzle. "Before we examine these," said Miss Marple, "perhaps Mr. Quincy might explain the rest of his actions. The recording device in the confessional, for instance." "That wasn't me," said the verger quickly. "I took the sermon, yes, and I left the threatening notes about Wednesday's confession, but I know nothing about any recording device." "That was my doing," admitted Catherine. "As I explained last night, I wanted to gather evidence of the church's complicity in covering up Sir Geoffrey's behaviour." "And the organ pipes?" asked Colonel Bantry. "The missing C notes?" Mr. Quincy looked down at his hands again. "That was me, I thought. If I could create enough disturbance, enough confusion around the upcoming confession service, the vicar would postpone it. Give me time to figure out what to do." "About what, precisely?" asked Miss Marple. "About the letter," said Mr. Quincy, gesturing to the yellowed envelope on the table. "About what it might reveal. I think," said Miss Marple, "that the time for secrets is past. Vicar, would you read the letter aloud?" Reverend Clement picked up the envelope with careful fingers. He extracted a single sheet of paper, covered in faded handwriting. Clearing his throat, he began to read, "Dear Reverend Wilson, I write to you in my hour of desperation, seeking the comfort of the church which has always been my solace. By the time you read this, I will have been sent away from St. Mary Mead, disgraced and abandoned. I carry a child, and for this I am to be punished, while the man responsible continues his life untouched by scandal. Sir Geoffrey Hawkins has used his position and influence to silence me, but I cannot leave without some record of the truth. I beg you to ensure that when my child is born, they will know their heritage, if not their father's name in the official record. For it is not only Sir Geoffrey who has wronged me, but Lady Hawkins as well, who arranged my dismissal and exile to protect her husband's reputation. She knows that her husband has a history of such behavior, yet she maintains a facade of ignorance. I have confided the complete truth to only one person in St. Mary Mead, Albert Quincy, who has promised to help me however he can. Please, Reverend, ensure that justice is done, if not for me, then for my innocent child. With faith in God's mercy, Rose Barton." As the vicar's voice fell silent, all eyes turned to Mr. Quincy, whose shoulders had begun to shake with suppressed emotion. "You were the only one she trusted," said Miss Marple softly. "The only one she told the complete truth." "Yes," whispered Mr. Quincy, "and I failed her. I couldn't find her. I couldn't help her." "But what is the complete truth?" asked Catherine, her voice trembling. "Is it that Sir Geoffrey Hawkins was my father, or that you were?" "Neither," replied Mr. Quincy, finally looking up. His eyes were red-rimmed, but his gaze was steady. "The truth is far more complicated. The child Rose carried, it wasn't Sir Geoffrey's, and it wasn't mine." Griselda gasped. "Then who—" "Sir Geoffrey's son," said Mr. Quincy. "Andrew Hawkins. He was 22 at the time, home from university for the summer. He and Rose fell in love. They planned to marry, regardless of the difference in their social positions. But when Sir Geoffrey found out, he was furious. He forbade the match and sent Andrew abroad immediately." "Andrew Hawkins," repeated Catherine. "My father was Andrew Hawkins?" "Yes," confirmed Mr. Quincy. "And that's why Lady Hawkins was so determined to hush up the scandal, not to protect her husband, but to protect her son. Sir Geoffrey took responsibility for Rose's dismissal to shield Andrew, and Lady Hawkins arranged for Rose to be sent far away, where the connection could never be traced. But then, why did my mother's diary name Sir Geoffrey, as the one who disgraced her?" asked Catherine. "May I?" asked Miss Marple, holding out her hand for the diary. Catherine handed it to her reluctantly. Miss Marple carefully turned the pages, her eyes scanning the faded handwriting. "Yes," she said after a moment. "I see. Rose writes that Sir Geoffrey Hawkins has ruined my life and cast me out, but she doesn't explicitly name him as the father of her child. Rather, she says, the Hawkins name will never be connected to my baby, though by rights it should be." "So she meant Andrew Hawkins all along," said Catherine slowly. "It appears so," nodded Miss Marple, "and Mr. Quincy, who knew the truth, has been protecting not only Rose's memory, but also Andrew Hawkins." "Where is Andrew Hawkins now?" asked Colonel Bantry. "He died in the war," replied Mr. Quincy. "In 1942, he never knew about the child. Lady Hawkins made sure of that." "And Lady Hawkins is still alive?" asked Miss Marple. "Very much so," said the vicar. "She's in her 80s now, but still quite formidable. She continues to be one of the church's most generous benefactors, and you feared that this revelation would alienate her," concluded Miss Marple, looking at Mr. Quincy. "That's why you went to such lengths to prevent the vicar from pursuing the matter." The verger nodded. "The church needs her support. And what good would it do after all these years to drag up the past? Sir Geoffrey is dead. Andrew is dead. Only Lady Hawkins remains to bear the brunt of the scandal. And me," said Catherine quietly. "I remain the living proof of what happened. The granddaughter Lady Hawkins has never acknowledged." A contemplative silence fell over the room. Miss Marple studied Mr. Quincy's ink-stained fingers as they twisted nervously in his lap. There was something about those stains, something that had been nagging at her since last night. "Quincy," she said suddenly, "those ink stains on your fingers, they're not just from the parish registry, are they?" The verger looked down at his hands in surprise. "What do you mean?" "The parish registry is written in black ink," explained Miss Marple, "but there are traces of blue ink on your fingers as well. The same blue ink, I suspect, that was used to write the threatening notes found in the church." Mr. Quincy's face flushed. "I've already admitted to writing those notes." "Yes, but there's more, isn't there? The ink on your fingers has a particular pattern. It matches the impression one would get from handling carbon paper, as I mentioned last night. Carbon paper used to make copies of documents." "Copies?" repeated Colonel Bantry. "Copies of what?" "That's what I've been wondering," said Miss Marple. "What document would Mr. Quincy need to copy?" And then it occurred to me, Rose Barton's letter. "You made a copy of it, didn't you, Mr. Quincy?" "Before the vicar found it." The verger's shoulders slumped in defeat. "Yes," he admitted. "I knew it was there, tucked into Reverend Wilson's Bible. I've known for years. When the old vicar died and his possessions were being sorted, I found the letter and made a copy. Then I replaced it where I found it." "But why?" asked Griselda. "Insurance," replied Miss Marple, before Mr. Quincy could answer. "In case the truth ever needed to be proven, or in case it needed to be suppressed." "Both," said Mr. Quincy softly. "I didn't know what I might need to do with it. I only knew it was important. And when Reverend Clement found the original letter and began asking questions, you panicked," continued Miss Marple. "You feared he would reveal everything in his sermon, so you took the sermon and left the blank page as a warning." "Yes," nodded the verger. "The blank page symbolic of how Rose's story had been erased from the village's history." "A clever touch," acknowledged Miss Marple. "As was the removal of the C pipes from the organ. C for confession, but also for the secrets connected to the Hawkins family." "I never meant to cause harm," insisted Mr. Quincy. "I've served this church faithfully for 15 years. I just wanted to protect the past, to honor my promise to Rose." "By keeping her story buried?" asked Catherine with a touch of bitterness. "By denying me knowledge of my true heritage." "I didn't know you existed," replied Mr. Quincy simply. "Not until you appeared in the village, asking questions about the parish records." Reverend Clement leaned forward, his expression thoughtful. "It seems to me that we now have several decisions to make. The first is whether to amend Catherine's birth record to reflect her true parentage. The second is what to do about Lady Hawkins. And the third," he paused, looking at Mr. Quincy, "is what to do about the verger's actions in this matter. If I may suggest," said Miss Marple, setting aside the diary, "there is one person who has yet to be consulted, and who perhaps has the greatest right to be heard. Lady Hawkins herself." "You want to confront Lady Hawkins with all this?" asked Colonel Bantry incredulously. "The woman is in her 80s. Age does not exempt one from facing the truth, Colonel," replied Miss Marple calmly. "Lady Hawkins has lived with this secret for 30 years. Perhaps it's time she had the opportunity to address it herself." "And what of Wednesday's confession service?" asked Griselda. "It's tomorrow evening. I think," said Miss Marple, "that it might proceed exactly as planned. A confession will indeed be made, though perhaps not the one originally intended." The vicar nodded slowly. "Yes, I see what you mean, Miss Marple. A public acknowledgment of the truth, after all these years. But will Lady Hawkins agree to such a thing?" asked Mr. Quincy. "That," said Miss Marple, "is what we must find out, and I believe there is no time like the present. Vicar, perhaps you could telephone Lady Hawkins and ask her to join us. I think it's time all the secrets in St. Mary Mead were brought into the light." As Reverend Clement left to make the call, Catherine approached Miss Marple. "Do you really think she'll acknowledge me, after all these years of denial?" Miss Marple patted her hand gently. "My dear, in my experience the burden of carrying a secret often becomes heavier with time. It's possible that Lady Hawkins may welcome the chance to set it down at last." Mr. Quincy remained seated, staring at his ink-stained fingers that had transcribed Rose Barton's letter, that had removed organ pipes, that had written threatening notes, all in service of a promise made 30 years ago to a young woman who had trusted him with her deepest secret. The blue and black stains on his skin seemed to him now like a visible manifestation of his complicity in a decades-long deception. "Will I lose my position?" he asked quietly. "That will be for the vicar to decide," replied Miss Marple. "But I suspect that once the whole truth is known, your actions may be seen in a different light." As they waited for Lady Hawkins to arrive, Miss Marple reflected on how the past and present were intertwined in the events of the last few days. A missing sermon, a blank page in a Bible, a silent note in a church organ, whispers in a confessional, candles that burned too fast, and ink-stained fingers, all pieces of a puzzle that stretched back 30 years, to a time when a young housemaid named Rose Barton had dared to love across the rigid boundaries of class, and had paid the price for that love with her reputation, her future, and ultimately her life. Now, as Wednesday's confession approached, the final piece of the puzzle was about to fall into place, and Miss Marple, with her keen understanding of human nature, suspected that the revelation would bring both pain and healing to those gathered in the vicarage sitting-room on this spring morning in St. Mary Mead. Chapter 6. The Sermon Revealed. St. Mary Mead's church was unusually full for a Wednesday evening service. Word had spread throughout the village that something significant would occur, though few knew exactly what. The pews were filled with curious parishioners, including Colonel and Mrs. Bantry in their usual place, the Prices from the post office, and even Dr. Haydock, who rarely attended weekday services. Miss Marple sat quietly in her customary pew, her keen blue eyes observing the congregation. In the front row sat an elegant white-haired woman, whose straight back and lifted chin spoke of decades of assured social position. Lady Hawkins. Beside her, looking somewhat uncomfortable in her proximity to such village royalty, sat Catherine Barton. The previous day's meeting with Lady Hawkins had been a revelation in itself. The elderly woman had arrived at the vicarage with the imperious manner of one accustomed to deference, but when confronted with the evidence of Rose Barton's letter and the knowledge that her granddaughter sat across from her, her facade had cracked. "I always knew this day might come," she had admitted with surprising dignity. "One cannot bury the truth forever." She had confirmed everything: her son Andrew's relationship with Rose, Sir Geoffrey's intervention, her own role in sending the girl away. "I was protecting my son's future," she had said, "but I've often wondered about the child. About you," she had added, looking directly at Catherine for the first time. The organ music began, somewhat diminished without the sea pipes which Mr. Harmon had not yet had time to replace. Mr. Quincy, still serving as verger despite the revelation of his deception, guided latecomers to seats. His fingers were scrubbed clean today, though faint traces of ink still lingered beneath his nails. Reverend Clement appeared, dressed in his vestments, his expression solemn but resolute. Griselda offered him an encouraging smile from her seat, near the front. "We gather tonight for a service of confession and reconciliation," the vicar began, "a time to acknowledge truths long hidden, and to seek healing for wounds both seen and unseen." He opened the Bible that rested on the pulpit. "You may have heard that my sermon disappeared from these pages on Sunday morning, that a blank page was left in its place. Tonight I wish to fill that blank page with truth." A murmur ran through the congregation. Miss Marple noticed Lady Hawkins straighten further, her gloved hands tightly clasped in her lap. 30 years ago, a young woman named Rose Barton left our village in disgrace," continued the vicar. "She died giving birth to a daughter, a child who grew up never knowing her true heritage. That daughter is with us tonight." All eyes turned to Catherine, who sat with quiet dignity beside Lady Hawkins. "The story that was whispered then was incomplete and in many ways untrue," the vicar said. "Tonight we correct the record, not to assign blame or to reopen old wounds, but to acknowledge a truth that has been hidden too long, and to begin the process of healing." He then related the story as it had been revealed over the past days: the love between Andrew Hawkins and Rose Barton, the intervention by his parents, Rose's exile, and Mr. Quincy's long-kept promise. "In our village we pride ourselves on knowing our neighbours, on maintaining traditions and standards," said Reverend Clement. "But sometimes in our concern for propriety, we can cause profound harm. The blank page left in my Bible was a powerful symbol of a story erased, of a life removed from our community's narrative." As he spoke, Miss Marple observed the faces around her. There was shock, certainly, and the inevitable relish of scandalous revelation. But there was also thoughtfulness, and in some of the older faces, a hint of recognition, perhaps even remorse. "Tonight," the vicar concluded, "we restore that missing page. We acknowledge Catherine Barton as the granddaughter of the Hawkins family, and we commit ourselves to ensuring that, in the future, compassion will guide our actions more than concern for appearances." Lady Hawkins rose then, with the help of her walking stick. Her voice, when she spoke, carried clearly through the church despite her years. "I wish to add my own confession," she said. "For 30 years I have lived with the knowledge of my role in Rose Barton's fate. I chose family reputation over the love my son felt for her. I sent away a young woman who deserved better, never knowing she would die, leaving her child, my grandchild, alone in the world. This is a burden I have carried, and a wrong I now wish to begin to right." She turned to Catherine. "I cannot undo the past, but I can acknowledge you publicly as my son Andrew's daughter and my granddaughter. The Hawkins name is yours by right, and all that comes with it." A hush fell over the church. Miss Marple felt a deep satisfaction at this moment of truth. Painful, yes, but necessary. The blank page was being filled at last. The service concluded with communion, a fitting symbol of reconciliation. As the congregation filed out afterward, Miss Marple observed Lady Hawkins and Catherine walking side by side, not yet comfortable with each other, but taking the first tentative steps toward connection. "An extraordinary evening," said Colonel Bantry, joining Miss Marple. "Who would have thought the old Hawkins scandal would resurface after all these years?" "The past is never truly buried, Colonel," replied Miss Marple, "merely waiting for the right moment to emerge." Mr. Quincy approached them, his expression one of relief mingled with lingering anxiety. "Miss Marple, I want to thank you. The vicar has allowed me to retain my position with certain conditions." "I'm glad to hear it," nodded Miss Marple. "Your actions, though misguided, were born of a promise to protect Rose's memory." "Yes," agreed the verger, "but I've learned that sometimes the best way to honor a promise is to bring the truth to light, not keep it hidden." As Miss Marple walked home through the quiet village, she reflected on the events of the past few days. A blank page, a silent note, whispers in a confessional, candles burning too quickly, ink-stained fingers, all had been clues to a mystery spanning 3 decades. The real sermon, she thought, had been revealed not in words written on a page, but in the actions and choices of those involved, in the courage to face long-hidden truths, in the possibility of redemption even after years of silence. In the village of St. Mary Mead, where she had observed human nature in all its complexity for so many years, Miss Marple had witnessed once again the power of truth to bring both pain and healing. The blank page had been filled at last,